Hello and welcome. You're about to watch the second of the stress response videos, the effects of trauma on the stress response, as part of the Wellbeing for Education Resilience programme. We would like to highlight the Face COVID video by Russ Harris. If you haven't already seen it, please take 5 minutes to watch it as it gives a great overview of how to support wellbeing as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic. You can click directly on the link when viewing this presentation in slideshow mode. This video will be looking at the effects of trauma on the stress response. Some of the topics touched upon in this video may be discussed in further detail in the concept index or in one of the other webinar videos in the programme. It may be helpful to take a moment to familiarise yourself with some of the other video webinar titles. Should you have any questions in regards to these videos, please forward these to your mental health lead and they can be discussed in one of our network meeting Q&As. Here you can see what will be covered in this presentation. If you see the thought bubble symbol, it will mean that there is an activity for you to have a go at, should you wish to. Simply pause the video and give it a go. Remember to always be kind to yourself when watching these video presentations. Be aware of how you are feeling throughout, and should you need to, take a break or check in with a friend. There are also some suggestions on the last slides for places you can go if you would like to seek further support. Now we are going to look at ACEs. This stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. These can be categorised into the three following groups: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. These experiences can affect a child's emotional, social, and cognitive abilities in later life. There has also been correlation between the amount of ACEs experienced in childhood and physical health in later life. If a child grows up experiencing ACEs, the world does not feel as safe and secure as a child who does not experience them, and as a result will be relying more on their stress response for safety and comfort. ACEs are explored further in the concept index. Although looking at ACEs can be really helpful when trying to understand some of our children's behaviours and emotional sociable abilities, we do have to be careful. So let's look at how ACEs can help us to help others. So they ensure that we're curious about what other people's lives are like and what's happened to them, and if that may be affecting how they behave or think or feel now. And they ensure that we listen responsibly and support the person and or their family. So it's really important though that it helps us to be aware of an individual's resilience and their coping and support. So if they're not as resilient, we know that this may be a reason for that. And then it helps us to support them and help them grow their resilience. However, it's really important to keep these things in mind when thinking of ACEs. And so using the list of ACEs for a checklist or screener, we really shouldn't do this. So what we mean by this is assuming that if a child has had 4 of the ACEs, that their behaviour must be due to that. Because what we need to remember is that every child is different. So their resilience levels are different. You may have one child who's experienced 1 of the ACEs and is extremely traumatised, and it's really affected them throughout their later life. But you may have a really resilient child who's experienced a lot of these ACEs throughout their life and they appear reasonably unaffected. So scores are meaningless. Numbers ticked do not equate to a level of trauma or need. Again, look at the fact that everyone's different. Our experiences, our biological makeup, and everything is different. So we can't assume that just because they've got 4 boxes ticked, they'll need a certain amount of support. It's about knowing our child and having those relationships and knowing what they need from that. And ACEs also do not take into account resilience and coping and support as I've said. So that young person may have experienced lots of ACEs, but also have a really strong support network. They may have grandparents, aunts and uncles, good relationships with their teachers and lots of friends who can support them throughout the process. However, you may have a child who experiences one of the ACEs but has no support networking whatsoever. They may not do very well in school. They may not have grandparents. They may not have any aunts and uncles, and they may struggle to make friends. So, as a result of having a small support network, that one ACE may affect them much more than the child with the large support network. So, just to sum up, ACEs are really helpful in ensuring that we're curious about the child and questioning could their background be affecting what's going on for them. It's really important not to use them as a scoring background or as a concrete reason as to why this child is definitely behaving the way they are. So we're going to look at what impact ACEs can have on child development. In a stressful situation, our fight, flight, freeze response floods the brain with corticotrophin releasing hormones. We'll refer to these as CRH. This is a normal protective response that lessens once a stressful situation passes. When repeatedly exposed to ACEs, CRH is continually produced, resulting in the child being stuck in a heightened state of alert. This means that they're unable to return to their natural relaxed state of recovery, meaning they might be reacting to everyday things as if it's a threat to life. So children and young people who are exposed to ACEs therefore have an increased or sustained level of stress. In heightened neurological state, a young person is unable to think rationally and learn, as we'll talk about a little bit more in the next slide, looking at the brain. The common responses to trauma include hypervigilance, so always looking out for stress or danger, hyperarousal, so they may experience emotions a lot deeper and a lot stronger, therefore taking them out of their window of tolerance. You can find the window of tolerance in the concept index. They may feel numbing, increased startle response, flashbacks, avoidance, sleep problems, anxiety, memory and attention problems, developmental delays, and attachment issues. These are normal responses to abnormal situations, but may be viewed as behaviour that may seem irrational, illogical, or risky. Such behaviours could potentially be misdiagnosed as a child being defiant, oppositional, or having ADHD. So this is another reason when you're coming against a child who may be showing these sorts of behaviours to really be curious and explore what could be going on for this child. So when we're looking at how trauma impacts the brain, we're going to go back to our 3 parts of our brain that we referred to in the other videos. We've got our brainstem, our limbic brain, and our cortical brain. So if we're thinking about maybe one traumatic experience that really affects us, or lots of smaller traumatic events, or maybe we're living with trauma every day, example neglect, what will happen is our brainstem will be firing a lot because we feel like we're needing to survive by ourselves. We don't have that safety and protection of our caregivers. Therefore, this part of our brain becomes maybe hyperactive. Whereas our cortical brain, because we know when our brainstem is firing, we can't necessarily access our cortical brain effectively or at all. Therefore, if we're constantly in this traumatic state or this survival state, our cortical brain won't be quite as developed as if a child who is constantly feeling safe. Therefore, our learning may be affected. In addition to systems responding to stress, other brain systems are also affected by trauma. These are our reward system, our memory system, and our threat system. Our reward system is what teaches us that certain behaviours come with reward and therefore motivates us to perform those positive behaviours. Our memory system is affected in a way whereby negative memories become much stronger in our minds and everyday memories become a lot less detailed. Our threat system, so this is looking at hypervigilance. If we think of always being in a survival state, we have become very hypervigilant to threat, assuming that there's a lot more threat around than there really is. Therefore, maybe certain social cues can be mistaken actually for threatening cues. This slide highlights the difference between general stress and traumatic stress. So heightened stress can be seen as a fight, flight, fear or freeze response. It's something that we all do sometimes. Whereas trauma has overwhelming stress at its core, which has left its mark and is easily triggered and relived through flashbacks. So in this slide, we're going to look at stress and trauma and what does it look like. So you may see slight differences in a young person experiencing too much stress or a young person experiencing traumatic stress. And I would like to emphasise this isn't just in children and young people, this could be in anybody. Both of which will lead to decreased learning in school or college and maybe attendance issues as well. So we'll start by looking at too much stress. This could be, for example, too much pressure to achieve, high workload, unreal expectations, difficulty in a subject being put on the spot, for example. So they may experience their fight, flight, freeze or flop response. We haven't yet spoken about flop response, but you can find more information on this in the concept index, looking into the window of tolerance. This is a hypoarousal in opposition to a hyperarousal. So with fight, you may see aggression and aggressive behaviours. With flight, you may see fear, panic or running away. Freeze, you may see vacating psychologically, or what we call dissociation. So this might look like daydreaming, yes-no responses. Or you may see faint or flop. So flop can also be referred to as collapse or drop. And this is when someone may literally feel faint and totally motivationless. Whereas if we're looking at traumatic stress, although you may see a lot of what we've experienced with too much stress, it's important to remember that the person will also be in hypervigilance, so they're always on stress response, as explained and discussed 2 slides previous. They may be experiencing repeated flashbacks or repeated nightmares, so they may appear very tired and restless. And they may be experiencing lots of angry outbursts. And these could be at things that we would say to be seemingly normal situations, but they may interpret them to be threatful. Here we have 2 links. One of these is to a video explaining stress on the brain by Islington New River Cottage, and the other is a 3 e-learning sessions from Minded. One is on the science behind adverse experiences, another building resilience and general classroom management.
When we're thinking about what trauma is, one definition is that it's a response that our body has or our mind has in response to a perceived threat, a threat to our survival or a threat to our emotional well-being. And it's not the actual event itself, it's actually about how our body and how our mind respond to it. And we think about 2 important elements that need to be present for a trauma to occur. First is that there's some kind of event or incident, or it can be a threat. So it might not actually be something that's already happened. It might be something that's looming, or something that's dangled in front of somebody, or something that's somebody's very worried about happening. And then alongside that external event, there's an internal response to the potential of that threat or the experience of that threat happening. And this internal response depends on many factors about the individual, about the family and community in which they live, and the different skills they have, and the outlook that they have on the world around them. And this difference in the internal response and the different factors that impact on whether somebody is traumatised from an event or not, or how traumatised somebody is from an event or not. This is where that difference comes in, where one person or a group of people can experience the same event, and within that group of people there'll be some people who are fairly traumatised by it, and there are other people who don't feel traumatised by the event at all. And the difference will be not about the event itself, but on the internal response and all those different factors that make up that. If you want to listen to the video there, this is really interesting to think about. Trauma is not what happens to you, it's about what happens inside you, and how if we take this approach to viewing trauma, then it's a really hopeful definition and understanding of trauma, because if we focus on what happens inside you, then there's a potential for healing and the potential for relearning brain patterns and behaviour patterns and habits. If it's something about trauma is what does happen to you, you can't ever change that. So this video is really helpful to kind of explain why this perspective on trauma is a really important one to have. It's a good watch. Sometimes memories are not stored within our language areas of our brain, because sometimes things happen to very young babies or small children, and trauma might happen or occur before the child has developed language. And in this case, memories are still stored within our brains, but they're stored more as sensory sensations and motor patterns. So they aren't stored with a story or an explanation. They're just kind of almost imprinted emotionally into our bodies. And this means that sometimes children, young people and adults can have what we might call flashbacks or kind of emotional memories that might come and be triggered via the senses. So something that they hear or see, something that they smell, some movement around them might jar them into some kind of sensation. So there's an automatic triggering. Their body remembers the feelings, the fear or the sense of helplessness or the sense of overriding shock, and their body will respond to that in terms of an upset stomach or butterflies or freezing. So the kind of stress responses can be triggered. And it can be quite bewildering, because children, young people, and when it happens to adults too, can sometimes be really confused as to why they've suddenly become feeling this certain way, but they can't actually put a story to it. They can't actually explain it, because actually they don't have memories that are kind of linguistically stored, because they're just sensationally stored. So it's really important that we think about children of all ages, and even think about what happens when babies are growing and are in utero, because stress that's experienced by the mother can also be experienced by the baby in utero as well. So traumatic experience can happen at any age, and we need to catch ourselves if we find ourselves saying, oh, it's okay, they won't remember that because they were far too young. And actually, they may not have a verbal memory of that. They might not be able to tell you a story about what happened, but their body may well have some memories stored as these sensational ones. Our learning experience are definitely impacted on by adverse childhood experiences and by experiences of trauma. And in terms of thinking about the impact on the brain, there may be some intellectual growth might be slowed down. There may be some physical growth slowed down in terms of actual thriving, in terms of body development. There often is a lot of hypervigilance. So hypervigilance is when a child or young person or adult is very preoccupied with just checking out all the information that's coming in through their senses, and they are checking out possible threats, possible alerts. They are kind of over observant in a way. Sometimes you can tell when children are being hypervigilant, or young people, they tend to enter a room and notice small changes that have been done really quickly, like displays changing, or chairs in a different place, or slight rearrangement of tables. They're the kind of young people that will definitely come in and say, well, because as soon as they walk into a room, they're kind of scanning it, taking all the information in. They sometimes may wander around the room and like to prefer to be the last person to sit, because they like to see where everyone else is going first, and then they kind of pick their position of safety. So they may linger around or fuss around, waiting for everyone else to kind of take their place for them to be seated. They might get anxious if they're not able to be seated by a door or a window. They may want to have a clear escape route. So these kinds of ideas around hypervigilance, they can sometimes be mistaken for inattention or attention hyperactivity difficulties. And there is a difference between children who have kind of attention and inattention difficulties, and may be very wobbly and like lots of physical movement and moving around, which can distract them, and children and young people who are hypervigilant. It can be very draining and tiring, hypervigilance, because children repeat these patterns of check-in and alert and safety planning every time they move from one place in the school to another. So if they transition from the classroom to the playground, a period of time will be resettling themselves, checking their environment. When they go back into their classroom, they'll do the same. When they go into the hall for assembly, they'll do the same. When they're walking down a corridor, they're doing the same. And when all this energy is taken up with all of this thinking and taking in all this information and filtering through it all, lots of information that we wouldn't normally give attention to, it can be very difficult for them to actually then stop doing that and to listen and take information in from the adults that they should be listening to. It may cause reduced impulse control, so children and people reacting much quicker, reacting without thinking a lot more often. It can impact on their self-esteem and how they feel about themselves. They may lack trust in other people. And being a learner is very much about trust. Trust in the adult will set you the right kind of work. Will trust that they will give you something that's not too boring, not too hard, not too difficult, not too easy. Trust that if you get stuck, you can put your hand up and someone will come and help you. So there is a lot of trust that's required in learning, and that can be really impacted on by experiences that have kind of given you the impression that people aren't to be trusted, and that you can't rely on other people, and that can make you quite a wobbly as a learner. And sometimes young people can be quite adverse to taking risks, or their curiosity can be quite stumped for fear of not being able to cope emotionally if they can't cope with the work, or they can't do the work, or they get stuck, or something goes wrong. They don't feel like they can manage the feelings that might be triggered from that, so they would rather just not do it at all, and sort of avoid the work, task avoidance, or refuse to do work, because that kind of protects them from that possibility that things might go wrong. When we're thinking about our emotional pot, the analogy and the window of tolerance, and how trauma impacts on how our emotional regulation works. The emotional pot analogy and the window of tolerance are talked about in more detail in the concept index, if you haven't come across those concepts before. When we talk about the emotional pot, and we talk about how emotions fill up in that pot, and how there is kind of a mesh system that helps to develop self-regulation, Experience of trauma and adverse childhood experiences could be one of the contributing factors that kind of block up that mesh filter area of our emotional pot. And then that results in the young person or child or adult not being able to self-regulate, not being able to ebb and flow their emotions as they come in and go during the day. But his emotions come into the pot, he just gets fuller and fuller and fuller until it just overflows and triggers off a stress response. We also think about the window of tolerance, the space between where the emotions are full in the pot and the gap between the top of the pot and the emotions. That's our space for tolerating uncertainty, or it's where our patience lies. It's what happens when we are happy to learn and be curious and be challenged. All of those things happen when we're in our window of tolerance, when we're regulated and we feel safe and we're ready to learn. And actually, it's suggested that children, young people who've experienced trauma, the window of tolerance can be slightly smaller too, to start off with. So smaller amounts of stress can still cause a similar stress response, because it doesn't take quite so much to actually get the emotional pot overflowing with emotions.
Here is a video from the UK Trauma Council that explains everything that we have touched upon in today's video. If you have the time, do click on the link and give it a watch.
One of the other impacts of trauma on our experiences of life is something of social thinning. And this is because sometimes the way that we behave, sometimes because of the increased stress responses that a child or young person has, this can result in kind of decreasing connections, decreasing social opportunities. Often if a child or young person behaves inappropriately, then they're kind of segregated from their peers, or they might be given a period of kind of time out or reflection time away from a group, or they may not be able to be around young people for safety. So all of these things end up thinning children, young people's connections. And what we know about what works in terms of healing from trauma and recovering from trauma and building our resilience is that connections and relationships and social interaction are fundamental to getting our basic human needs met. And as Karen Treisman says in her TED Talk, where the link is here if you want to watch that, she talks about how all relationships are the most powerful mental health intervention known to mankind. So it's really, really key that relational trauma requires relational repair. And so it's really, really important that we try to build in more connections, more connectedness, even more so when there are difficulties with behaviour and stress responses, trying to think about obviously safety first, but also think about emotional safety and opportunities for social engagement and connecting with other people. The Thurrock COVID-19 Child Wellbeing Support Line has been set up to support children, young people, their families and school staff during the coronavirus pandemic. It is for anybody to call or email if they'd like to speak to somebody about an issue or a theme to do with wellbeing. This can be staff from school, parents and family members, young people themselves. If they call the support line number or email the helpline email, leave a message with their name and contact number, and someone from the team will call them back. There are also some other contacts here for local support services. Now we're at the end of this session, it's a good time just to check in with yourself and to see how you're feeling now. As we said in the beginning, the content of the WER Prgm can impact on how we're thinking and feeling and how it relates to us in our everyday lives. If you've been affected by anything you have read or heard about today, please seek support, either from your own support network, and there's some ideas listed on the slide here, or from additional support networks, whether that's local services or national sources of support.